Hi, I'm Olivia Stefanino, and I'm delighted to be joined here today by David Mitchell, the author of the book The Word on the Street. David, I'm so excited with this book. So what made you actually want to write it?
Well, when I became a town crier, which was 26 years ago, I thought, well, I want to read up because that's what I naturally do. I read. So I went into the library. I said, can you find me something on the history of town crying? They didn't have anything. I said, no problem. Go on to county store. They didn't have anything. I know what to do next. British Library, they'll have something. British Library came back and said, no, we haven't got anything. We don't think anything's ever been written. That was frustrating. I wish I could say I immediately saw that was an opportunity. I didn't. I was frustrated for a while, but eventually I realised this: if nobody's written it, why shouldn't I? So I started out on the process of researching the history of the roles of the town crier and bellman.
Wow, is that just in the UK or is that further abroad?
Well, the tradition exists all over the world, but I focused particularly on the UK because I could see that the scope of the subject would just get impossibly wide unless I focused it down. So this particular book is UK only.
So we've now spotted another opportunity. There we go.
Son of, yes.
Indeed. But this isn't your first book, is it?
No, the first book I did was called For Crying Out Loud, and that was more focused on history in Chester and on my personal experiences. But this is not personal experience, this is solely history, and it's much wider in its historical scope because since the first book I did a research degree, Masters by Research, University of Chester, and that opened up so many doors to finding out new things.
Ooh, I can imagine. So many of us who perhaps didn't enjoy studying history at school might think, oh, that's all going to be a bit sort of dry. Is it?
Well, I think the dry thing is when you get hooked up into dates and kings and queens and battles and so on. This is the history of daily life. For example, before there were mortuaries and obituary columns, if somebody died, somebody whose funeral you'd want to attend, and you had to attend it within 3 days because had to get the bodies under the ground that quickly, how would you ever find out that that person had died? And the answer is the funeral bellman would go around the district announcing the time and the place at which your corpse would be buried.
Well, that sounds like scary stuff. What else is in this book that we might find really, really fascinating?
Well, let's take divorce. Until the Divorce Act, then I think it was 1875, then you couldn't get a divorce unless you were very rich. But of course, people wanted to separate. And the myth grew up, it was never had any legal foundation, that you could separate if you went through a certain procedure on market day and you engaged the services of the local bellman and town crier to conduct an official wife sale.
A
The
wife
wife, a
sale?
wife sale. The wife had to agree. It had to be my mutual agreement, and she would be taken with a straw halter round her neck, just like as if it was a cattle cow, and she would be auctioned off.
And would she know who she was going to be auctioned off to first?
Well, sometimes there was a previous liaison going on,
Ah,
just making official what was already happening, but sometimes it would be a complete stranger who she would then depart with.
how interesting. And have you ever been asked to perform such a duty?
No, but I'm open to the possibility.
Good stuff, good stuff. So, who is this book really aimed at?
The book's aimed at really anybody who is interested in the history of everyday life. As I say, not the kings and queens stuff, but how ordinary people live their ordinary lives. There was an example of a guy in London. He was an innkeeper, a hostelry keeper, and he wanted to separate from his wife, so he engaged the town crier to arrange it. And then a fortnight later, the town crier was called upon again because the purchaser wanted to part with his bargain.
So, here's a question for you, David. Do you think life has changed that much since the time of the book to now?
The technology's changed, obviously, because what the town crier used to announce, now you can hear over the internet. But what hasn't changed is the subject matter. People still die, they still have the funerals, they still fall out with their marital partners, and people lose things. That's something else the town crier used to announce. If you'd lost something, you can't wait until the next edition of the local newspaper, it might be a week later, particularly if you've lost something as valuable as your child. So that was one of the things that the town crier used to do very commonly, is to announce missing children.
Missing children, missing wives, missing children, missing husbands, perhaps as well. So, who then is the person who commissions the town crier?
Well, that varied. If it was a personal announcement, for example, a missing child, or you've lost your sovereigns, or your dog's gone missing, then you would go directly to the town crier and you'd say, well, I'm going to give you whatever his fee was for an hour's worth of proclamations. On the other hand, if it was a matter of, and a lovely example is after the Great Fire of London, Chester decided you could no longer have thatched roofs in the city centre. Then it would be the City Assembly, the precursor of the City Council, who would commission their crier to go around and make that announcement so that people would know the new local regulation that they were obliged to obey.
And did the town crier kind of do anything off his own initiative, or was it always other people that would come to him and say, this is the news that we want you to impart? Or did you go around looking for stories?
He didn't have, by and large, he would take instruction either from the local authority or from individuals.
But I bet he was the person that knew all about what was going on.
Highly likely to know pretty much everything that's going on around, and to be a very popular character. Because you have a relationship with that news bringer that you wouldn't have with the internet or even with newspapers. It's a much more personal medium because you would be standing within a few feet of the person that was giving you the local news.
So do you still do the proclamations now in Chester?
Well, people don't realise that there's something unique about Chester. Some 200 places around Britain have town criers, but only in Chester do we have this tradition of the midday proclamations that happen in the summer months. So if you come to Chester, you know you can see a town crier at a fixed time from a fixed place, the High Cross in the very centre of the city. And interestingly, Chester is the only place in the world that chooses its town crier on the basis of his photogenic good looks.
Evidently. So let's get back to the book then. And when did town crying actually start?
Well, that was one of the questions I asked myself when I first started out, but then I realised that's a foolish question because it's the only, not foolish that you're asking
it, of course not.
that I was asking myself, because it was the only technology available. Before you had print, you would just have somebody standing where people gathered, normally the marketplace, and get their attention by whatever mechanism. It could be a handbell, it could be a trumpet, it could be a horn, and then stand there and make an announcement. So that would have happened simultaneously in lots of countries all over the world, and nobody would have thought, well, this is really remarkable, we better make a record of this for historical purposes. No, that didn't happen. So we're never going to find out where it began.
So, but we know where it's going because you've very kindly written a book for us that describes all of that. And what do you see as the future of town crime?
Well, town crime didn't seem to have any future at one point, because when print took off, and particularly advertising and posters and so forth, then it seemed that the town crier was dying out altogether. And that leads us into one of the best stories I've discovered in the book, is this gentleman called Billy Law, who became the town crier of Horsham in 1902. And because the role was so running out of steam really, and they weren't even sure if they needed a new town crier, they said, well, we're going to appoint you, but we're not going to supply you with a uniform.
Well, you'd need the uniform, that's what kind of makes it, surely.
Well, you would think. So for 10 years he was doing a really good job wearing what was called his Sunday best, and in those days your Sunday best was a very, very valuable part of your personal resources. So after 10 years of doing a great job, he got so fed up that he wrote to a national newspaper and said, I want to demonstrate that my council really should value me more. I'm going to challenge all the town criers of Britain to a contest. And so that was the origin of what has now become an annual tradition, the British Town Crier Championship.
So there's a whole community around the country that's thriving with this.
And yes, the really wise places appoint a town crier.
I can see why. So it's good for tourism.
And there's a connection between social media and the town crier, because when you're putting an announcement out on say Facebook, you post onto, and historically, when a town crier had to make an announcement, particularly if it was from a local government, then there would be two things that would happen. He would go around making an announcement, but he'd also post up the wording of the announcement in some prominent position in the town. So the whole idea of posting a notice, which we've now preserved on Facebook, it actually comes from the days of the town crier. Well, we know that we've had town criers in Chester right back to 1554, when he was announcing the banns for the Chester Mystery Plays. So there's wonderful continuity there.
And you're now taking that tradition and making sure that everybody can learn from it moving forwards.
Yeah, hopefully, yes.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you so much for your time, David. That has been really fascinating for me, and I'm sure for everybody else who is going to be reading this book, and I really recommend that you do. It's The Word on the Street, and it's a history of the town crier in Belman, written by my delightful friend here, David Mitchell. Go get the book.